Hello, I'm Joshua Sparrow, Executive Director of the Brazelton Touchpoint Center, and we are back with Learning to Listen, Conversations for Change. Today, we will be listening to Dr. Rosemarie Allen and learning how to disrupt implicit bias within ourselves and in our work with children and families. We are incredibly fortunate to have her join us today. And soon you'll see why she is so highly sought after. But before we start, I want to be sure you know about another opportunity to disrupt implicit bias. The Brazelton Touchpoint Center's first virtual national forum will be on April 6th through April 8th, and it will be all about working together towards racial equity with children, families, and communities. If you'd like to find out more, just go to brazeltontouchpoints.org and click on the Offerings tab. That's brazeltontouchpoints.org. Click on the Offerings tab. Over 3,000 people from around the country and around the world registered for today's webinar. So we're really enjoying finding out in the chat who you all are and where you're from. And with so many people, we want to be sure you know that if you're having any difficulty viewing the webinar in Zoom, you can watch it live on our Facebook page. Just search for the Brazelton Touchpoint Center in Facebook, and the live stream video will be pinned to the top of our page. Today, our superb interpreter, Maria Jose Gutierrez, joining us from Bogota, Colombia, will be simultaneously translating our webinar in Spanish. Thank you so much, Maria Jose. So to access the translation, click on the interpretation icon in your Zoom controls. Then select Spanish. To mute the English in the background, select Mute Original Audio. La conversación de hoy será en español e inglés. En los controles de su reunión, haga clic en Interpretación. Haga clic en el idioma que le gustaría escuchar. Para escuchar solo el español, haga clic en Silenciar audio original. If you have a comment to share, or if you need help with a technical issue, please use the chat feature. And you can also email Kayla Civelli with any technical problems. And Kayla will put her email address in the chat multiple times since there's so much else going on in there right now. And if you have a question or comment, please use the question and answer box. Dr. Allen has generously agreed to stay with us for an extra 15 minutes. If you can hang in there with us, that will be from 4 to 4:15 Eastern time, 2 to 2:15 Dr. Allen's time in the mountains, and 1 to 1:15 out on the west coast of the US. She will be with us for 15 extra minutes at the end of her presentation to answer your questions and respond to your comments. Tomorrow, you'll receive a thank you email with a link to a recording of today's webinar and a link to our feedback survey. You can also access the recording on our YouTube channel and our website. Again, that's brazeltontouchpoints.org. And if you'd like to receive a certificate of attendance, please do be sure you complete the feedback survey so we can get one to you. Now, before we begin, I want to be sure to thank our sponsor, the Burke Foundation, and our fabulous Brazelton Touchpoint Center production team, Kayla Civelli, Ashley Gaddis, and Michael Accardi. Thank you all. And now I'd like to introduce today's guest, Dr. Rosemarie Allen. Dr. Rosemarie Allen has served as a diversity, equity, and inclusion leader for over 30 years and is president and CEO for the Institute for Racial Equity and Excellence, the lead agency for ensuring equity in educational and organizational practices throughout the nation. She has worked with the United States Department of Education, as well as 48 state departments of education, the United States Customs and Border Protection, Public Broadcasting Service, that's PBS, police officer standard training, and numerous police departments, school districts, and other organizations providing training on implicit bias, microaggressions, anti-racism, and racial equity. Dr. Allen is Associate Professor in the School of Education at Metropolitan State University of Denver, where her classes ensure leaders are aware of how issues of equity, privilege, and power impact human interactions as well as teaching practices. She's also served in the Colorado Department of Human Services as the Director of the Division of Early Learning and in Youth Corrections. A national expert on implicit bias and culturally responsive practices, Dr. Allen speaks at conferences across the country, does a weekly segment for 9 News KUSA on racial equity at all levels of society, and has the distinct honor of being appointed as a global leader, connecting with early childhood leaders around the world. Welcome, Dr. Allen, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I am going to jump in and get started. I'll share my screen. I'm just overwhelmed and honored by the response and by the number of people who are excited about this topic and wanting to have these conversations. Now more than ever, we need to be able to talk about race and racial equity and how it impacts us in early childhood. So as I get started, I just want to make sure that my screen is being shared okay. If I can get a thumbs up. I can't see it, so I'm going to assume that it's okay. Okay. All righty. So let's go ahead and get started. Whenever we enter these conversations, they can be a bit scary. And I just want to make sure that everyone is comfortable and for everyone to know that this is a safe space. So some basic understandings first that you don't see on the screen is that this is a safe space and we allow each other the space and grace to grow. I promise you that as you continue on this journey, I promise you, you're going to make mistakes. We all do. But we have to allow each other the space and the grace to grow. So there's no blaming and no shaming. And we have to remember that we're in a mess. This is a racial mess, but we didn't create this mess. We didn't create it. And while we didn't create it, we don't blame and shame each other because we're in it. And we have a personal and professional responsibility to correct it. Where you are is okay. We're all at different places in this journey, and wherever your place is right now, it's okay. However, when you know better, you have to do better. So let's get started. We're going to talk today a lot about implicit bias. And we have to talk about it because even though we believe that we see and treat people as equals, unconscious bias impacts how we view people and how we treat people. And you may be wondering, well, why do we need to talk about this in early childhood? Because this is a space where we love each other and we love children and we really work well with families. But we have to face the reality that even in early childhood, racial disparities persist, especially in suspensions, expulsions, and our interactions with children and their families. We know that children are suspended very young and very often. And across all settings, the average school day, we see about 250 instances of a preschooler being suspended or expelled. And this is just preschool. Do you know that children are expelled from their early childhood programs as early as 7, 8, 9 months old? Mostly for, wait for it, what do you think children are suspended for, babies at 7, 8, 9 months old? Fighting and excessive crying. 2 of their main jobs, but we're suspending and expelling children very, very young and very often. And there's also inequities in who gets suspended. We know that boys are suspended, and they are suspended a lot. We know that boys make up little more than half of the preschool male population, but there's 78% of those who are suspended. And Black children, they're suspended a lot. They're suspended nearly 4 times more than their white friends. We know that AAIN, Alaskan Natives, and Native Americans are suspended disproportionately. But what we don't see Latinos suspended disproportionately in early childhood, but that number goes way up in K-12 programs, and it's the same with children with disabilities. But why is this happening? Why? What's happening that we have such an equity in how we discipline children, how we treat children, even in early childhood? And one of the biggest factors is implicit bias. Let's define implicit bias. Implicit bias is a mental process that results in how we feel about people based on their difference, based on how we see them as different from us. It could be based on any category of diversity, any of our isms. It can be age, gender, height, what we value in terms of attractiveness. In any way that we perceive people different from us is where implicit bias lives and grows. And it's an unconscious process, and we're not aware of the negative biases that have developed over the course of our lifetimes. So what does this mean? It means that from the time you were born, and perhaps even in utero, you received messages that are recorded on an inner recording. I made up the inner recording part, but I want you to imagine that your core, right here, is where an internal recording device is, where it resides. And imagine on that internal recording device is everything you've ever seen, smelled, experienced, heard. All of your experiences are recorded. The problem is you don't know what's there. You don't know what's recorded. For instance, let's just say that your caretaker, let's say your mom, was holding you at 4 months of age and walking in the park. She took you out of the stroller and she's just walking and holding you and talking. You know, at 4 months, babies are smiling and very, very responsive. And all of a sudden, a big brown dog runs up, bares his teeth, starts barking and barking. Your mom pulls you closer, holds you tight. She's kicking at the dog. She's screaming. The dog is barking. She's holding you. And people come back and all of a sudden the owner comes and he pulls the dog away and the incident is over. She's holding you so tight and her heart is racing and you feel the heart racing, and it was a very traumatic experience. But you were safe and it was never even discussed again. So that was when you were 4 months old. But let's imagine now that you're 44 years old and you're walking through the park, and all of a sudden a big brown dog is off leash and running towards you, and you panic. You experience a fear that you didn't know you were aware of. You start screaming. And the owner comes and pulls the dog back, and you don't know why you had that reaction. But it could be based on an experience that was recorded on your inner recording that you had no memory of. That's how implicit bias works. And implicit bias also supports stereotypes. Now, I told you that implicit bias can be based on any difference, any category of diversity. But today, we're going to focus on racial bias. And people say to me all the time, you know, Rosemarie, it's not only about race. And they're right, it isn't. It's not only about race, but it is always about race. Always, always, always. Because on every single indicator of child well-being, Black and brown children are at the very bottom. The biggest problem in our country is a racial problem, and we must talk about race. So, as I said, implicit bias resides in our unconscious minds, but this yellow area is what I want to focus on. Unconscious attitudes are less egalitarian than we explicitly think about race. So, what am I saying here? What I'm saying is that we all believe we're better than this. We all believe we're better than this. And we believe it because we want to be. No one wants to walk around with a badge of honor. Yeah, I'm biased. Who wants that? This whole idea of implicit bias and where it comes from is an inheritance that we don't want. We didn't ask for this. But because we live in a biased society, it's like drinking biased water and breathing biased air. We don't want it, but we're exposed to it and we can't help it. And it's very important for us to understand this and to understand the causes of implicit racial bias so that we can do the intentional work, so that we can be intentional to do the work that it will take to mitigate the negative consequences. I'm going to say this about 5 times during this hour, but aware is halfway there. Once we bring it to our awareness, once we bring the unconscious to our awareness, we are halfway there. Let me give you a visual. Let me show you just how fast we engage in implicit bias. And I'd like to use this ladder of inference as a graphic for that. So, like any ladder, you start from the bottom. So the first rung here, I select data from what I observe. Everyone we meet, every single person we meet, we size them up. We look at them and we size them up. And the way we do that is adding meaning. You select data from what you see, and then you add meaning to that data. And the meaning is cultural and personal. And once you add the meaning, which is actually where you start to make things up, then you make assumptions based on the meaning you added. You draw conclusions, adopt beliefs about the world, and then you take action based on your beliefs. And this happens in milliseconds. We don't know we're doing it. And it's a process by which we determine meaning about what's happening around us. Let me give you an example. The observable data, and I'll use myself. Rosemarie walks right in and doesn't speak to me. Do you know that speaking is cultural? It is. Some of you were taught to speak when you walk in a room. You were intentionally taught that your job when you walk into a room is to speak. And then there are some of you who were taught when you walk into a room, you don't disrupt, you don't interfere, you don't interrupt, you wait for an opening. So imagine the cultural disconnect. If I'm taught to speak when I walk into a room and you're taught to wait, this actually happened to me on campus with one of my colleagues. I was taught to speak when I walk into a room. If I walked into my mom's house and she's sitting around talking to her girlfriends, not only must I speak, but I must hug. Hi, Auntie Crystal, hug, hug. Hi, Auntie Zona, hug, hug. And did you catch it? My mom's friends are my aunties, another cultural norm in my family. But if I wanted to get in big trouble, I could walk in and say, hey, I'd be in trouble. Now imagine someone not being raised that way who might see me and think somehow I was rude. So let's go up the ladder. I select data. Rosemarie rushed right by me and didn't even speak. And then I'm going to add my own personal and cultural meaning to that. And you know what that is now. Did you see her? She walked right in here past both of us and didn't even speak. I think she has an attitude. I don't think she likes us. Then I'll make assumptions. You know what? She thinks she's better than us because we're paras and she's a teacher and but I'm working on my degree. And when I get my degree, let's see what she does then because she doesn't even bother to speak to us right now. And then I draw conclusions based on my beliefs. She'll never treat us fairly. And that can shape the entire relationship for the entire tenure of that staff person. Let's try another one. The observable data, and I left it out here, but it's a big, let's just say it's a big black boy. Dr. Walter Gilliam said there are three risk factors for being suspended: being big, being a boy, and being a black boy, big black boy. I added a D to that. Big black boys with disabilities, they are the most suspended in America. But the observable data is that it's a big black boy. I select data. Oh my goodness, that child is big and he looks rough. They said he's 4, but he looks like he's 7. I add my own personal and cultural meaning. I spoke to him, he didn't even speak. I think he has an attitude. I can't get a smile out of him. I better watch him. Then I make assumptions. He's probably going to be really aggressive with the other children. I better watch him because he's big, and if he's aggressive, he might hurt them. I take action based on my belief. I know we're going to have to put him on a behavioral plan because he's big, and if he hurts a child, that's going to be an issue. And we go straight up this ladder in milliseconds. We've all done it. It doesn't make us bad people. It means that we have all been impacted by implicit bias. And I'm going to share with you one of my most shameful and painful experiences with implicit bias. I believe in the power of sharing our stories because when we do, we allow others to be. So this happened a few years ago when my son was attending Howard University in Washington, D.C. He grew up here in Colorado where we barely lock our doors and he's never feared for his personal safety. So when he decided he wanted to go to Howard, it was a scary time for us. And during that time, the campus was in the middle of a neighborhood that didn't have a good reputation. It was deemed dangerous and undesirable. But he went there and he flourished and he did very, very, very well. Very well. He found himself and he evolved as a Black man at Howard in such a beautiful way. And halfway between, the 4 years between his sophomore and his junior year, he wanted to move off campus. And he met with his dad and I, convinced us that it was a good idea. And we said, okay, now you're bound to engage in implicit bias when you have to make snap decisions, when you don't have enough information, and when there's fear. So all of those things were moving with me. I didn't have enough information. The decision wasn't snap, but it felt like it because I just wasn't ready for him to move off campus. But once we said yes, I went into mama bear mode and I started looking for a place, found a perfect place not too far from campus. And my son went and met the people who were living there. He was going to share it with 4 other graduate students. And that was great because he's such an old soul. So he met them, he loved them, they loved him, ready to sign the lease. They were. I wasn't. I needed to see this place with my own eyes. So I flew to DC and I drove to the address. Now, as a side note, I have sensory integration processing disorder. For those of you who have worked in special ed, you know what that is. And the way that my sensory issues show up is the way I get lost. When I get lost, I get really, 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 really lost. And I get disoriented. It's a physiological response. I get lightheaded. I get totally disoriented. It's not a pretty look. Anyway, that will make sense in a minute. So I'm driving down the street of Washington, D.C., and I pull up and I'm about to turn left. And I know I'm in the right place. I'm not lost because I see the pink house. And I make my left turn feeling really good about myself because I didn't get lost. And you know what that's like if you have ever driven in Washington, D.C. So I turn left, I make my left, and I see the pink house. I'm about to pull in and park. But just as I'm parking, I look at the house next door. And standing on the porch is a Black man, a rather large, rather dark Black man. He had on a white shirt and he had on jeans. He wasn't sagging because he had on a belt, and the belt kind of fell below his belly. But you know what I did? I went straight up the ladder. I took one look at this Black man standing on his porch. Now, this is in milliseconds. And my first thought was, oh no, my son can't live here. This place is too dangerous. And my second thought was, I hope the resident office is open. I need to go get his dorm room back. And my third thought was, what the heck just happened? I caught myself. in milliseconds. I caught myself and I thought, did you just look at a Black man and decide the neighborhood was too dangerous for your Black son? I did. And when I realized what I'd done, the shame that washed over me is indescribable. The shame was so powerful that all I could do was put my hands on the steering wheel, put my head down, and sob. I cried and I cried and I went through this whole period of unworthiness. How did I do this? How could this happen to me? This is what I fight against. I fight against this my whole life. That could be my husband. And the guy looked like my husband, by the way. And I just couldn't believe I did it. And I was crying and crying and crying and crying, snot nose cry, fake eyelashes off cry. And then I realized I've been sitting here a long time. And I looked over and the guy was looking at me. He runs down the stairs and I'm thinking, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap. And you know what I wanted to do? I wanted to take off. I just wanted to take off. And I thought through it. Okay, you're in a rental car. He doesn't know you. He doesn't know the car. If you leave, he'll never know. Just go. But I didn't. I decided to face the fear. What was the fear? I decided to do what I encourage each of you to do when it happens to you. Not if, but when. And that's to face it. Although I needed an excuse because I'd been sitting in my car for a long time. So he got to the window, are you okay? I said, I'm okay. And I got myself together. And I got out, he goes, ma'am, you're crying. What's the matter? I said, oh, no, I'm just being silly. And he said, well, what's wrong? I said, well, I have sensory integration processing issues. And when I get lost, I get really lost. And I thought I was lost. And I started talking really fast. He goes, ma'am, calm down. I understand what sensory integration processing issues look like. Here's another bias. You do? How would he know that, right? But anyway, I worked past it and I said, my son's a student at Howard and he's going to be living here. Do you go to Howard too? He goes, I go, I'm a resident of the hospital. I'm involved with the medical school. Oh, I would have missed that. I would have missed that. But he didn't have to be a future doctor. He could have been a janitor or a Walmart worker or librarian. But what he should not have been, he could have even been homeless, but what he should not have been was deemed dangerous simply because he was a Black man standing on his porch. And I did that. I did that to him, me, of all people. And what a shock to me. Because you know what? I love Black men, love them without shame. My daddy's the greatest man I ever met. My uncles who raised me and loved me and nurtured me. I was the favorite, a daddy's girl and an uncle's girl. I love my husband, my brother, my son, all the folks in my neighborhood who nurtured my growth. I have never had a bad experience with a Black man. So how did I do that? How did I look at a Black man and decide the neighborhood was too dangerous for my Black son? That's how implicit bias works. I too am impacted by this. And I thought I was better than this. That yellow area on the other slide when I said we believe we're better? We're not. We're not. Implicit bias is based on inaccurate information and stereotypes. This is the part, the second bullet, it makes it hard for us to live up to our value of equity and fairness. No one could have ever told me that I was capable of that. No one. Implicit bias disrupts our conscious commitment to equity and fairness. The reality is that we are all biased, every one of us, but aware is halfway there. If I hadn't been aware, if I hadn't been so deeply engaged in this work, I could have gotten in my car and driven and made the left turn and says, oh my, there's the pink house right there. And then I could have pulled up, looked around and said, something about this place doesn't feel safe. I'm going to go back to the housing office and get my son's dorm room and we'll try again next year. I would have gone through that without even examining it. So what is my lesson to you? My lesson when you get involved in this is to stop, notice, and wonder why. Stop, okay. Notice I'm feeling uncomfortable and wonder why. That's how we bring it to the surface. but we also have to talk about the issues. We have to talk about race, and we don't want to. It's uncomfortable. We have become so politically correct that we don't know what to say, when to say it, who to say it to. Do I say Latinx? Do I say Hispanic? Do I say Latino? Do I say Black, African American? My girlfriend said, Rosemarie, I'm Chinese, I'm not Asian. We don't know what to say. Let me give you an example right in my own family. My husband was born in 1949 in the segregated South. He's turning 72 this year. I was born in 1949 in Los Angeles. No, I wasn't. I was born in 1959 in Los Angeles. My husband, 1949, me, 1959. When my husband was born in 1949, what do you think his race is listed on his birth certificate? Oh, Jenna, you're close, not quite. What do you think his race is? Yes, Jocelyn Andrea, you got it. My husband is colored. My husband is colored. 10 years later, I am Negro. When I had my daughter in 1983, she is Black. And in 1994, when my son was born, he is African American. You're absolutely right. And this is one family living here today. No wonder we're so confused. No wonder we don't want to talk about race. It feels personal. And white people are afraid they're going to be blamed. They're going to be white shamed. And people of color are afraid that they are going to be accused of playing the race card. And people who are not accustomed to race really, really get defensive. So right now, I want to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to have a short talk with Dr. Joshua Sparrow.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen. People are loving your talk and really deeply moved by your story. I can see you're looking at the chat, even though you said you couldn't do two things at once. You're doing it. I guess I'm wondering about how you create a safe space for people from different racial backgrounds, different cultural, ethnic, educational, economic backgrounds, to be able to have these conversations when they may not want to or may not recognize that there is a need to have them.
You know, Josh, the way that I do this is to be authentic, to show up authentically, and to also share our stories. The story I just shared is a painful story for me. If you were to touch my heart races every time, and I've been sharing it a lot. But it's necessary because we have to create an environment that says, I've been at that space too. I've been in that place too. I used to say me too, but then I get mixed up with another movement. But we have to say me too. Yes, I've done it. And when I can stand here as a Black woman who have spent most of my life on racial equity and social justice and say, I did this, I think it opens the door for everyone else to examine what they've done and how they've engaged in this.
You were just talking about the many different reasons why people may avoid talking about race, why they're uncomfortable with it. And I don't know if you're planning on telling this story, but I love your stories. And there was a story you told about your daughter and a soccer game. I think it was, another really great story about how uncomfortable it gets when we're uncomfortable and skirt around the fact that we got to talk about race.
We have to, and we've become so afraid that we become foolish. And you're right, my daughter's a cheerleader, and those of you who have children who are cheerleader moms cheer for cheerleaders, funniest thing. And I'm there like, great cheer, and one of the other moms said, now my daughter was the only Black child in her class. I mean, like only Black girl in 9th grade, 10th grade, that thing. So she's the only Black cheerleader. I'm cheering, and one of the moms says, "Oh, is your daughter a cheerleader?" I said, "Yes, she is." She goes, "Which one?" And I'm like, I almost said, "The little blonde over there." But we want to talk, but we have to be authentic. And we don't want to ask those kinds of questions, although in some ways it's appropriate because we do have transracial adoptions and things like that. But we have to be authentic. And people can tell when you are. And it comes across very, very strongly. And when we're not, people can tell as well. Dolores says, "I was a cheerleader mom." So she understands we cheer for cheerleaders, absolutely. So thank you for that question, Josh. I'm going to talk about what this looks like in early childhood, and we'll come back for another question in about 10 minutes.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr.
All righty. So we talked about bias in early childhood and why we don't want to talk about race, but let's just talk a little bit about what it feels like. Oh, you're seeing my screen? I'm going to assume you're seeing my screen here. But what does this look like in early childhood programs? Thank you, Angela. So this is what it looks like: mispronouncing, making fun of, or shortening children's names that are not traditionally white. Someone just made a post in the chat box, and I can't pronounce the name. So this is what happens when you have a child or have a family member or have a colleague and you can't pronounce their name, you ask. So the person, and I'm going to say Geisha, I'm guessing Geisha Yahya Mohammed, I'm going to ask you to unmute and pronounce your name for me, if that's okay.
I'm not sure
Oh, that maybe she can't unmute.
Yeah.
But we ask the person to pronounce their name. That's really important.
Hello?
And yes, is that Geisha?
Yes, you say it correctly.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
Yes.
And then you get this pride when you say it correctly. And Geisha, I can't imagine how many people mispronounce your name. Has anyone ever tried to change your name or shorten your name?
Oh, many times. And I always take a minute to remind them, this is how you pronounce or spell my name.
Thank you very much, Geisha. This is important. A person's name is their identity. And I'm going to speak the truth in love. You have no right to change a person's name. You have no right to shorten their name. You have no right to make fun of a person's name. I had a child whose name was Hallelujah, and I heard two teachers making fun. I can't believe they named that child Hallelujah. Can you believe it? You don't know the story behind a person's name. It turned out that that mom had had several miscarriages, like 8 or 9. And when her baby was born, she just said, "Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah." And they decided to name that child Hallelujah. Who are we to criticize? Your job is to pronounce it correctly, to spell it correctly, and to honor the name. So that's very, very, very important. Also, assuming a Spanish-speaking Hispanic child is undocumented. The way that we show bias in early childhood is to assume families who have accents are not intelligent, rather than honoring what it takes to be bilingual or trilingual in an English-only country. That's another whole topic. Or weaponizing a child's name. How do we do that? Connor, stop. Connor, don't. Connor, get over here. Connor, what are you doing? Connor, do you want me to call your mother? Connor, Connor, Connor. That is weaponizing a child's name. When a child hears their name, that should be with love and nurturing and care, not as a weapon. But I have to be honest with you, I did it. And I did it to Connor. That's why I use his name. I didn't know better, but now I do, so I'll do better. But at the time, my Connor, don't, Connor move, Connor come over here, Connor, please, Connor sit by me, circle time, Connor sit in my lap. I called Connor's name so much that one day there was a ruckus in the block area. And I said, "Hey, what's going on over there?" And a little girl said, "Teacher, it was Connor." And then I realized Connor wasn't even there that day. But I taught the children in my class that Connor was the troublemaker. and he was to blame for everything. Talk about passing down bias. That is something we do. So that's another form of bias. Being afraid of the neighborhood where you work. Again, speaking the truth in love, you cannot be an effective teacher, administrator, home visitor, whatever your role is, you cannot be effective if you fear the neighborhood. I work with a teacher. I asked her to stay late with me. And she goes, oh, Rosemarie, I need to get out of this neighborhood before dark. Oh, my goodness. Who are you fearing? You are fearing the families of the children you work with, their uncles, their aunties, their family friends, and their neighbors. You cannot be effective. And it shows acute disrespect. We show bias when we assume students only eat stereotypic food. We show bias when we favor one group of children over others. We show bias when we call on some children while ignoring others on race, gender, class. I used to be an evaluator for our quality rating and improvement system. I had to tell some teachers in early childhood that there were some children that they never spoke to the whole day. The whole day. We have to be aware of that. Or assigning roles based on gender or race. Or assuming and stereotyping Black girls and their Black teachers and their Black mothers as too loud and too sassy or too angry. I can't tell you how much we are measured to avoid the stereotype of angry Black women, angry Latina women. That's a form of bias in early childhood. Or treating a person differently because of their hairstyle. Do you know that this is so prevalent that there are 7 states in our country that makes a law against it? It's really, really important. And then misinterpreting children's actions and ways of being as defiant. Let me show you an example.
Come here. Now, well, you in timeout. Look, my bracelet came out. I'll put it back on. You in timeout. There's no excuses. You're supposed to be back in timeout. I didn't say get out. You and Jayla in timeout. Well, let me tell you this, Linda. My name ain't Linda. So you sit right there in timeout, little bad little girl. No, let me say something. No, don't tell me. If I was here, I would surely take a day off from you and then a day off from these kids. I'm in the classroom. I'm just done with you. I'm done with you too, but you in time out. Oh, let me tell you something, honey. This is not noise. You're gonna be in time out? Oh. That's why you're in time out right now. I think so. I think so. Well, when I get up out of town and go to bed, I will be glad to go home and enjoy the rest of my life. And I completely quit school because all of you.
Wow. Do you know that little Black girls are only 20% of the female preschool population, but 54% of those who are suspended? And this is anecdotal, but the top 2 reasons are sassiness and hair. We can talk about hair another time. But my point is that we misinterpret children's actions and ways of being as defiant. Was she defiant? She wasn't defiant. She had a lot of mouth. She had a lot of sass. She's very confident and sure of herself, but she wasn't defiant. She did not say, no, I'm not going on timeout and you can't make me. Actually, she gave us an indication that she would go on timeout because she said, but when I get up from timeout, I'll be glad to go home and spend the rest of my life. And then she said something that's totally aligned with research. And then I will simply quit school because of all of you. Do you know children who have been suspended are much more likely to drop out of school, much more, 10 times more likely to enter the juvenile justice system? The girl is confident, articulate, she's sure of herself. Even when the teacher very inappropriately called her a little bad little girl, she didn't internalize it. She told the teacher, if I were you, I'd take a day off from these kids and from here. She knew it was not her. She knew somehow that it was the teacher. And you're right, the teacher was wrong going back and forth. Absolutely. But let's just take a minute. And Josh and I think Josh has another question for me. Dr. Sparrow.
I am here with you, Dr. Allen. I just wanted to note that our friend Deborah Bergeron said she would like to hug the little girl and the teacher.
Yes, both of them, both of them.
Both of them, yes. So you've been talking with us about what implicit bias looks like in early childhood settings. And I know there's so much more that you can teach us about that, about how to catch ourselves and what to say when we see it, what to do when we see it.
Mhm. You know, it's so important that first we own and acknowledge that implicit bias happens in our early childhood classrooms. And the data tells us that it does. And then we have to catch ourselves in our bias. And that's what I did with the guy standing on the porch. I caught myself in the middle of my bias. We have to catch ourselves and disrupt ourselves. And then we have a responsibility to help our coworkers to see it and to disrupt bias where it lives. So let's just say that you catch your teacher, your co-teacher, who's so hard on Black boys. And right now, just say in the middle of, she's having a Connor moment, one of my Connor moments. And she's saying, Jamal, stop. Jamal, don't. Jamal, do this. Jamal, I don't know what I'm going to do with you. First, to disrupt implicit bias, we have to have a treasure chest of responses ready to go. Many of you, if just in the chat box, tell me, have you ever witnessed bias and was so neutralized and paralyzed you didn't know what to say and the moment left you? How many of you had that moment? You hear something, you hear a white child say, I don't want to play with you because your skin is brown, or I don't like your hair, or whatever those things is. Yes, 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 I see it. We have all been there. But imagine that moment, because many of you are saying, yes, I know if you're like me, you wish you had a rewind button, because about 5 minutes later, you have the perfect comeback, but you wish you could rewind and say it. So we can't. We lose that moment. We lose that opportunity to teach and help others to grow. So in order to avoid that, Josh, what we have to do is develop a treasure chest of rapid, ready responses. Responses we can use in a variety of situations. That offends me. I don't think that's funny. That word doesn't help us to feel safe here. Remember, our classroom is a safe space, and when you talk like that, people don't feel safe. So what can we do? Say, do you know that's hurtful? Or look at your friend's face and look at that. Or when we do that, it breaks a person's spirit, and we're about spirit building, not spirit breaking. But whatever those responses are, to have them ready, write them down, practice them, put them on a tablet in your pocket. So when you hear it, you can disrupt it, not only in an early childhood space, but you could disrupt it at 7-Eleven. If you hear someone in lines telling two people speaking Spanish, you need to speak English, you can interrupt it if you feel safe and say, that offends me. I don't think it's okay to interrupt someone else's conversation. They have a right to speak whatever language they like. But we can interrupt bias, because what that does is stops it in the moment. And people who are being microaggressed are rarely in a situation where they can defend themselves. So we talk about being an upstander. This is a perfect time to be an upstander, to be an ally, to be an accomplice by disrupting it in the moment. So I think, Josh, I'm going to go back to my screen, and then we'll have a few minutes at the end. Is that okay?
Oh, good. Yes, I'm so glad that we get to come back together.
I know. So there's the little girl that someone would like to hug, and her teacher. So another pitfall in terms of implicit bias in early childhood spaces is saying, I don't see race, I just see children. That's not true. It's not true at all. We see race and we see it all the time. Those of you who logged on to this Zoom, when you came on, you saw me and you noticed I was a Black woman. I want you to notice everyone wants to be seen and honored and valued. I mean, I once had a person say, Rosemarie, I don't even notice you're Black. It's like, but you just did, because you didn't say you didn't notice I'm white. I want to be seen. I want you to know who I am so that you can understand how I walk on this planet. It's very, very important. And I had a friend whose teacher says, well, I don't see race, I just see children. And my friend said, then I don't want my child in your class, because if you don't see them and their uniqueness, then they're not going to do well with you. So people want and need to be seen. There's a danger of engaging in this race neutral ideology. And sometimes you hear colorblind, race neutral. When we know better, we do better. Colorblind, that term is ableist language, because there are people who are actually diagnosed with colorblindness. So I'm trying to move away from that. So when we engage in race neutral ideology, issues of equity are avoided. When we engage in this ideology, it promotes this fallacy that people are beyond bias and race and racism. And then we actually engage in deficit model thinking that ignores disparities. And then we blame communities of color on all the ills of society. And then it contributes to racial inequities by invalidating the experiences of people of color. And that is not what we want to do or need to do. So what do we do about this? I just gave you a lot in about 45 minutes. But what do you do? I want you to know that we can control implicit bias, but it's hard work. It's not easy. You have to be intentional, and you do it every single day. Deprogram yourself, retrain your brain, and accept and expect discomfort. Notice when you're watching TV, who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? I'm a Family Feud person. Who are you rooting for to win? Is it based on race? Notice when you go to the supermarket, who do you ask for help? Who do you easily chat it up with? Notice your behavior. And as you notice, you're going to become uncomfortable, I promise. But you can be intentional about expanding your reality. You need to seek opportunities to positively interact with other racial groups. I mean, it's not easy, but it's doable. You don't want to come up to someone. I mean, I'm a Black woman. I don't want someone to come up to me and say, hey, you're Black. I don't have any Black friends. Can we be friends? That would be a little bit awkward, but you can initiate an amazing book group, literary group. You can do that online. Hey, I am expanding my reality, and I'm going to be reading this book, Cast, by Isabel Wilkerson. Anybody here like to do that with me? Get involved in social groups that are racially and ethnically diverse. Here's a homework assignment for you. Those of you who are on Facebook or other forms of social media, take a look at your friend list. Make a chart that says, and this is visible, I know, but make a chart that says Black, white, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, conservative, liberal, and then start charting your friend list. Do you have a diverse group of friends? Now, you have to go a step farther, because if you have a diverse group of friends, it doesn't mean you interact with them. When you go on Facebook, the friends you interact with the most are at the top of your friend list. See who's at the top. So if you have 1,500 friends, are there 40 at the top that all look like you, think like you, share your religion? Take an inventory of what you're doing. And then share your non-biased, non-racist beliefs with those in your network. That's very important, because that's where the real work is. It's really easy to talk these things through with people who think like you do. But what about your friends and relatives who don't? You will need to use that treasure chest to stand up to biased and racist individuals within your sphere of influence, so that you can help make the implicit explicit. I love this. Stop, notice, wonder why, Michelle. Thank you. The treasure chest to disrupt the language. thank you so much. There are so many takeaways I hope that you will leave here with. I know it's been a short period of time. That does end my presentation. And now we have a little time to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen. The chat has been incredibly animated, as you were able to see. We won't be able to get to all of the questions, but I want to thank everybody who isn't able to stay past the hour for not only joining us today, but really listening and really learning and really reflecting and being so deeply engaged. People want more of your teachings, as you can see, and we would be grateful to have them. I also wanted to remind those who can't stay with us that we have our national forum virtually on April 6th through 8th, which is all about working towards racial equity. It's not like we necessarily ever get there, but something we wake up every day to work on with children, families, and community. And you can go to the Brazelton Touchpoints.org website to learn more about that. So I want to start with a question of my own, if that's okay. And when we talked a week or so ago, I think we said it was okay to address each other by our first names, Rosemarie.
Yes.
Rosemarie, I was thinking about this idea of a treasure trove, and when you witness a microaggression, say in an early childhood setting with colleagues, and you talked about rewinding. I was wondering about whether or not in the culture of an early childhood center, is there a way of getting people ready for the times when it is necessary to dig into the treasure trove to say something? So, and specifically, earlier you talked about your own implicit bias and how, as painful as it was, you had to sort of learn that about yourself and accept that, well, that's how human brains are made. We get not enough information that connects with old memories and experiences, and we jump to conclusions. We climb up that ladder of inference. So in Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he also owns his own implicit bias and racism. And what I got from that is that if we accept the fact that we are inevitably racist, if it's okay to say that, it sort of sets the ground for us to be ready when it's time to dig into the treasure trove. If that's in the culture, like we all understand, that's our starting place. We all have implicit bias, and we all, I don't know if it's okay to say, we all are racist in our own way and have to work every day towards being anti-racist. So I just wanted to run that by you and find out what you thought.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And Josh, that's why I start with the whole idea we're all racist. I mean, we're all biased. We're all biased. Now, there are two frames of thought when it comes to if we're all racist or not. Now, Ibram X. Kendi believes that we all have the capacity to be racist. However, critical race theorists believe that racism is a combination of prejudice and power. And because some people of color, don't have the power to sustain systemic and institutional racism, that they can't be racist. And I know it's semantics, but I think it's important for people to understand those differences.
Yeah.
But I believe that we can all, every one of us are biased individuals. And acts of bias feel very much like racism. But when we talk about structural racism, the ability to implement that and sustain it across systems and within institutions, then that's where it gets to be a little dicey. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the distinction is we talk about implicit bias when we're talking about ourselves and others as individuals, and we talk about racism when we talk about systems and structure where there is power.
Absolutely. And in those conversations, this is a great beginning, and I'm so thankful that it's so well received, but it is a beginning. We do have to have subsequent talks about how implicit bias impacts families and children, but we also have to get to the point where we talk about structural, systemic, and institutional racism, when we have to look at our policies, our processes. For instance, this just came up recently where there was a policy that was changed to require fingerprints, of a background check requiring fingerprinting for parent volunteers. And this same discussion was about increasing the number of families who volunteer. Do you see how that policy in and of itself can really be a problem for communities of color? Not because they're all criminals, but because so many communities of color have a culture of privacy. They are more likely to have had interactions with law enforcement simply because of systemic and structural racism. And then they don't want to be judged by that, plus families who are undocumented. And then there's a strong distrust because of racial trauma and generational trauma, a strong distrust from communities of color and helping the helping careers. So that policy in and of itself, where it doesn't appear to be racist, will promote and continue racism because it will prevent families from volunteering. And we know that when we are engaged with families, children do better. So it just goes on and on and on and on. And now I forgot what your question was because I got caught up with that one.
Well, no, I think, I was wondering sort of where you stood with regard to implicit bias and racism and their distinctions. And, what I get from your answer is racism refers to power, structures, systems. Implicit bias is the work that we can do within ourselves and with our colleagues in our interactions.
May I make another distinction, Josh?
Yes, of course.
That, and this isn't an easy one for people to accept, but implicit bias can translate into individual racism because the system works so well for some people, primarily white people, that their personal racism is sustained by systems. So what does that mean? It means that the person in Central Park can respond to a Black man with her personal racism and say, I will call the police, and know that that structural, institutional racist system will reinforce her, that she uses that system to reinforce her own personal racism. Does that make sense? So that type of advantage that white people have where systems support their racism, that communities of color don't have.
Right. And for those who don't remember that incident, the woman who was white did not have her dog on a leash where the dog was supposed to be on a leash. And the man who was Black was bird watching.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And the dog, I imagine, was disrupting the bird watching and the birds as well as this
he was
Black
an
man.
avid bird watcher. Yes.
So there was one comment that was a quote from Sonia Renee Taylor regarding the use of the term colorblind, which I thought I would read to you just to get your thoughts. Here's the quote from Sonia Renee Taylor. We may be trying to convey how we don't judge people based on racial identity, but in quotes, colorblindness is an act of erasure. Not only does it make invisible all the experiences a person has had that were shaped by their racial identity or color, it implies that to truly respect another human being, we must obscure their areas of difference. Remember that we live in a world of default bodies, the bodies we imagine when we close our eyes. The default body becomes the template for the normal body. The only reason we would need to erase someone's difference is because we still equate difference with danger or undesirability. When we say we don't see color, what we are truly saying is, I don't want to see the things about you that are different because society has told me they are dangerous or undesirable. So I just wanted to share that with you because I know there's a lot going on in the chat and to get your thoughts on that.
Josh, I'm going to ask you to email that one to me. I
I
think
will.
I'll add it. Yes.
Lots of other questions and comments. Here's one that may be related to that. I'm not sure it was. How do we get past labels and learn to treat each other as human beings first? I am 58% Native American and 23% Spanish, and I identify as Native American. But all my siblings identify as Hispanic.
Hmm.
I fear we are creating more divisiveness instead of learning to just be more tolerant and respectful of others.
And I love the goal. I love the goal of removing labels. But those labels, although they're all social constructs, none of them exist. Race doesn't exist. It's all made up. There's a high value, there's this currency that is placed on these labels. And until we get rid of the values that's associated with the labels, we can't get past the labels. And again, read the book Caste by Isabella Wilkerson, and she really helps us to understand what those labels are, how pervasive they are in our society, and what we will need to do to get to that place of utopia where we see humans as humans. You know, it's so funny. You know, the one place that it exists, and I'm just guessing this. This is a Rosemarieism, and it is in organ transplants. That's the only place I believe we're race neutral. I don't believe when a person needs an organ, a kidney or a heart or a cornea, if race is ever considered as a factor. I believe that's the only place because, and it's amazing because it's proof positive that underneath the skin, we're what, 98% alike? 98% alike. But yet the labels based on our skin color is pervasive across every area of our lives here in this country and now the world.
And there, I want to ask you if you're also touching on the distinction between race and racism.
Yes, now race, and that's funny because people are always, oh, what race and racism, which came first? Racism was first. And as Ta-Nehisi Coates says, racism is the parent and race is the child. Racism was created to race was created to justify racism. Before the Bacon's Rebellion, race wasn't so much of an issue, but it was created to categorize people based on opportunity and wealth. It led to the system to categorize others, to set up a hierarchy, and to really support wealth, and slavery is basically where that came from. Yes.
Now there's a question about what if our assumptions prove to be true? How do we balance the need for appropriate safety planning with concerns about our implicit biases?
Excellent, excellent question. Again, a Rosemarieism. And I have to say that because when you're a researcher, you can't just make stuff up. So the things that I think that have not proven through research is a Rosemarieism. And I believe that this process of going up the ladder, that whole inference, all of that implicit bias, I believe is like this primal instinct that we had early as humans to assess situations to keep us safe. And I still believe that we need to assess situations to keep us safe. Unfortunately, the messages that are recorded on our inner recording have equated safety with race. Black and brown people are unsafe, white people are safe. And because we're so impacted by implicit racial bias, that aware is halfway there comes up, that stop, notice, and wonder why. There are times that you may feel that this is really not safe as a woman. And my husband just posted this on his Facebook page about the conversations that we've had. I used to travel 2 or 3 times a week before COVID. And every now and then my husband will travel with me. I was driving this time and looking for a parking space. And he said, babe, there's a parking space right there. It was right next to the door, closest parking space, and to him that made sense. And I said, I can't park there. He said, why not? And it was so funny, it's because it wasn't safe for me as a woman. It was in a corner, in the dark. And every time I've traveled, I've avoided that space because as a woman, I didn't feel safe. And if I parked into a space where I didn't feel safe, I had my keys already in my hand, you know, the way you're taught to hold them between your fingers so you can poke someone's eye out and, you know, all of that stuff. So that's that assessment of spaces, of people, of interactions where we have to assess situations to be safe. But again, if we stop, why do I feel unsafe? Notice there's nothing wrong here. Wonder why. I got on a service elevator and in the hallway was a man who appeared to be homeless. He was just sitting there. When I walked into the little hallway before you get on the elevator, I'm carrying a food tray and I stopped. First, I have a very sensitive startle response. So that was me. I stopped and there he was. Fear, my heart started racing. Notice your heart's racing, you're afraid. Wonder why? Because there's a man sitting over there in a corner that I didn't expect to see. Is he bothering you? No. Has he gotten up to attack you? No. Is this a dangerous situation? Not right now. So what did I do? I was tempted to turn around and walk away, but I didn't, because then you cross that point of microaggressions. And I'm standing there with my hands full and I looked at him and he looked at me. We were both surprised each other. And I said, can a sister get some help around here? Can you at least press the button for me? Oh yeah, Miss Lady, of course, sure enough. And he got up and pressed the button and went back in his corner and sat. But you assess it, stop, notice, and wonder why. And that's how you break up that reliance on implicit bias that's based on race.
Yeah, you know, the thing about this question, what happens when your assumptions are proved right, suggests to me that what happens is that becomes another one of those memories or experiences that leads you up the ladder of inference. Mm-hmm. Because what you were right about was not that this child was a boy and big and black and disabled. Mm-hmm. What you were right about was that there was something else that didn't have anything to do with any of those things, those things get in the way of seeing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Nice, Josh.
So we have a few more minutes. And again, I'm so grateful for this extra time with you. And there are still 1,000 people with us. Yeah. So I thought maybe as a last question, to talk about white allies and Black and brown people, and about the conversations we all can have together about standing up and speaking out, and how we go about having conversations that help us all understand white allies, Black and brown people, about when and how and why to stand up and speak out.
Thank you so much. You know, we talk about white allies and accomplices and microaggressions and standing up. We have to own the fact that while our biggest problem in this country is race, communities of color didn't create it. None of us really created it, but the people who have the most power to dismantle it are white people. White people have the most power. And in so many of these situations, our communities of color are the victims of it, but yet we're on the front line fighting against it. So as white people, what can you do? And it's to stand right alongside of us, and step in when needed. My son is an incredible activist, and he's gone to Ferguson and Minnesota, everywhere there's something, he's there. And I'm always amazed at the wall of protection of white people around him, who make sure he's safe, make sure he's fed. They look out for him. They stand up for him. They protect him. If you want to know more about how to be a good ally and accomplice, standing up for racial racial justice, SURJ. Just Google it. There's probably one wherever you live. But as you stand up, don't hesitate. You want to check in with people of color to see what their needs are. But when you witness a microaggression, like we talked about, interrupt that. Interrupt it when you can. When you see injustice, interrupt it. In your own communities, with your uncles and grandfathers and in-laws, interrupt it. When you're out on the forefront, if you look at the protests that took place during this pandemic, look at how multicultural they were. So people are standing up. You still need to elevate, ensure the elevation of Black and brown voices. It's always amazing to me, and I'm going to say this really fast. Even when you see posts or blogs and you don't always know, or you don't always agree, that's not the time for you to make people of color educate you. You know, if a person of color says Dr. Seuss books offend me, I could always tell on the post, here comes a white person that says, well, you know, it's based on history and it was accepted back then. Accepted by who? It was acceptable to do that. By who? People of color protested those caricatures back then. It was only acceptable for white people to be racist and do it in spite of that. But is this how I have to defend my posts to you instead of you educating yourself? So to answer your question, to be an ally, to be an accomplice is to walk with, to take the lead from people of color, and not to walk above, because there are sometimes that people want to save, be the savior, and that's not the position. The position is to partner. And there's a quote, and I'm going to get it all wrong, that says, if you're here to save me, then you don't need to be. But if your liberation is tied to my liberation, then we can work together. So someone's got that quote. You can pull it up and put it in the chat box. I think it was Audre Lorde. But if your liberation is tied to mine, then we can work together, but not if you're here to save me. And I think that's going to wrap us up, Josh.
Yes, I hate to say goodbye, but hopefully we'll be able to visit with you again and learn with you. There are many comments in the chat asking for more time with you. Thank you so much for our time together today, and from your really important stories straight from your heart, straight to ours. For those of you who are saying goodbye, thank you all for joining us and being so engaged. And please do take a look at brazeltontouchpoints.org for the work that we can do together to fight for racial equity. Thank you, Dr. Allen. Thank you, Rosemarie.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Josh, I would love to have a copy of the chat since I could not keep up at all.
All right, I think we can get that for you.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you all so much.